Hello and welcome back to my channel after quite a few months of my being absent. Lots of reasons for that I shan't really go into this video. However, welcome back to Sweden, because that's where I am now. I've been wanting to make a video for a while, but I didn't really know the best way to approach making a new video and what I wanted to make. However, since it's a new year, it's the 1st of January now, I thought what better way to kind of end last year and bring in a new year and hopefully bring in a time of more videos from me with the sort of top 10 books from last year. This is just a box standard video. I'm just going to sit down and going to talk to you about the books that I loved the most, and I have ranked them. I have no qualms about ranking books, and I've got a few honourable mentions which I want to start out with. So I'm just going to dive on in and try to get used to talking to the camera again. So I think the best place to start is, of course, the honourable mentions, and I've got 3 books for this one. The first book that I want to talk about isn't actually a book that I read last year. It's a book that I read at the end of 2018, and that's The Old Drift by Namwali Serpell. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it only 3 stars when I first read it. There were a lot of things that I loved about it, there were a lot of things that I found quite difficult about it, but I wasn't really wholly sure about how I felt about it. So 3 stars kind of seemed like the best I could give it. And then last year I went to an author's talk with Namwali Serpell, and there was something about the way that Namwali was talking about her book and the things that she was saying that made me see the book in a completely different light. It made me learn so much more about the book, about the parts of the book that were actually true, which I hadn't realised when I read that there were parts of it that were based on real things that happened, i.e. the Afronauts, which was a really interesting part of the book and part I really enjoyed, and it's nice now to know that it was based on something that actually happened. So I wanted to mention it in this video because where I read it so close to the end of 2018 and then 2019 I experienced the book again in a new way without actually having read it. It made me want to add it here, and I hope that when the paperback comes out I'm going to read the final finished version. And then I think the second book for my honourable mentions is very similar to The Old Drift. It's Bangkok Waits to Rain by Pitchaya Sudbanthad. I think that's how you might pronounce it. Apologies for getting it wrong. And it's all focused on Bangkok, and it happens in multiple different times with multiple different characters that are linked in some ways. So it's on paper it's the sort of book I love, and I did really enjoy reading it. It had a lot of similarities with my reading of The Old Drift in that there were parts of it that I really adored. However, there was just a few flaws here and there, which didn't bother me so much, but it bothered me a little bit. But I always forgive it, and I wanted to put it on this list anyway, because despite the flaws, I think for a debut novel, it's kind of what you would expect as somebody who's trying to find their voice, trying to find the pattern of writing and everything. And it was a really meaty task to write this book, I imagine at least, because it's quite a broad book in scope. So of course there are going to be some teething issues, but I think the book itself has so much promise of what we can expect in the future that it made me really excited, and I had to put it on this list. And then of course the final honourable mention is Pereira Maintains by Atonio Tabucchi. Now this one is a book that I actually really enjoyed, and I think the only reason it's not made my top 10 was because I wanted a bit more from it, which I didn't get, and I think I talked about this when I wrapped it up earlier in the year, but it still stayed with me, this book. It stayed with me, and it's made me consider how writing can be done in different ways. I think the notion of this Pereira Maintains that happened throughout the book created such a really interesting voice that it still makes me think about it every time now, and even when I'm writing an essay, which I'm in the middle of doing at the moment, I still think back to that book and think, oh, that's a really interesting way of writing and creating a voice when writing. So I'm it's not that I'm using that style in my essay, but it helps to kind of figure out your own voice and your own pattern, your own style of writing, and I think I really appreciate that. So whilst it wasn't perfect, I still wanted to mention it in this honourable mentions list because it has stayed with me since I've read it. So now the top 10, I'm going to go down from 10 to number 1, which was my absolute favourite of the year. Number 10 is Frostheart by Jamie Littler. I was a bit unsure as to whether I'd put this on the top 10 or in the honourable mentions. It's a 5-star read, and for what this book is, it's absolutely perfect. It is perfect children's fantasy adventure with little bits from here, little bits from there, sort of all these ideas that come together to make the perfect story. And it was perfect in that sense. And I think, there's so much enjoyment to be had in that book. The only reason it's made number 10 and perhaps not further down the list is the fact that whilst it was great and it was really enjoyable, it's not exactly one that's going to stay with me for a long time, and it delivered exactly what I wanted from it, but it hasn't done anything more since then. And that's not a bad thing. It's a really great thing. It's a great time to enjoy a book, but other books on this list have really, really stuck with me. So comparatively, it just didn't make the cut to kind of go further down the list, despite how well it was crafted and how well it was written and how beautifully it was illustrated too. So number 9 on my list is Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. It's almost like the opposite to Frostheart, in that this book is not perfect. It's not like the best book out there. It has its own flaws. It has lots of things that, that wasn't the best about it, and yet somehow it still managed to deliver real emotion. It really got me. This really touched my heart, this story, much in the way that the Travelling Cat Chronicles did last year, and that made my top 10 also. This book did very much the same, in that it wasn't like the book that you're going to rave to everyone about, that everyone must read. However, it really deeply impacted me. It made me very emotional. It created such visceral feelings when I was reading it, and I think it's a powerful thing when a book can do that. So I really enjoyed that. I really appreciated that, and that's why it's made the list, and that's why it's kind of beat Frostheart too. So yeah, so it's difficult because it's not one that I would recommend everyone to read, because as a book it's not life-changing or anything, but it has a very touching story. And there are parts of it that are very, very sweet and very emotional. And number 8 is Silk by Alessandro Baricco. Now this one is, I think this is very similar to Pereira Maintains, in that it was a little bit too short and I really wanted more from it, and it didn't have everything that it could have done. However, the way it was written and the story that was told was really impactful and really beautiful, very touching, and it was just a really lovely story, and I think the fact that I wanted more from it goes to show how much I was enjoying it, and despite it being such a quick read, it has left a real hole in my heart where I want more to be filled from this story, and I think it was just a really great read, to be honest. It was just exactly what I needed at that time, and it just lingers with me. I think that's the thing with this book, is that it has stayed with me since I read it, and I've been thinking about it, I've been thinking about the storyline, I've been imagining how it could look in various different ways. I mean, I know it was adapted into a film, and I don't really want to watch the film, because in my head I've made my own film of it. And it was just a really beautiful story, and written in a really beautiful way, or at least translated in a really beautiful way. So that's why it made my list. And I guess from now on, we're getting into the good, solid 5-star reads. So number 7 is Arturo's Island by Elsa Morante. Now when I read this, I went in with a lot of expectations, a lot of hope for this, because I'd heard a lot of good things and it sounded really intriguing. And then I started reading it, and it was very different to what I was expecting it to be, but in a good way. I was really engrossed in it. I was really fascinated by these characters, and they were all semi-detestable characters. It was just a slice of their life, set in the backdrop of one of the islands off Naples, set in a very specific time, and it was captured so perfectly, this time and this place, and the way that the place kind of has an impact on the people and their mindsets. And I think in a way, that it has that similarities to Wuthering Heights, in that the place becomes a character in itself, and the place actually lays the groundwork for shaping the characters within it. There was something about this book also that made it special, that when I was reading it, I had this feeling, or I had this hope that there was something that was happening under the layers, that I was am I projecting onto this book what I want to come from it? But then as the story progressed, it became more and more real, and this concept that I had quite early on suddenly came to fruition in the book towards the end, and I was oh, is that just because this story was being told so well that you pick up on all these cues and you make these assumptions? And I wonder whether the time that it was first written, whether readers would have had the same impact, or was it because this book has just been translated and brought out once again at like the right time. It speaks for our current generation despite being written so many years before. So it had that really interesting temporality to it where I was like, oh, I love this book, and I don't know whether I love this book because of what it was in its time or whether it's because of what it is in current time, and what does that mean, and all of these sort of additional thoughts about it. It was a very nourishing book in that it provided so much like meat to really kind of tuck into and enjoy. So number 6 is Deeplight by Frances Hardinge. Now this book was brilliant. When I first read it, I was so enthralled by the world. It was so richly portrayed, this world, and the characters were really interesting characters, and the way they moved around the world and the way that the world interacted with them also was just fascinating. And I think the reason why I loved this book so much this year was because, like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I really enjoy reading young adult. I've read young adult literature for quite a long time, but I've read a lot of bad young adult literature and sometimes it's very hard to kind of continue to be in love with a genre that keeps putting out stuff that you're just not enjoying, and it's making you think, wait, am I just growing out of this? Are my tastes just changing and whatnot? But this book kind of reinforced what I love about the young adult sort of literary body, and it kind of reminded me of the reasons I love it, and that, you know, good books can exist within the young adult world, and that, you know, sometimes it just needs to be like there just needs to be some sort of like care and attention put into the worlds that are created, rather than kind of producing things quickly just to keep up with the market and the tastes of selling these books. At least that's my thoughts. However, so this one was just such a pleasurable read because of all that, and it just made me so happy to read it, and I loved it, and I think more people should read it, and finished copies are beautiful. So number 5 is Children of the Cave by Virve Sammalkorpi. Not sure how to pronounce the name actually, but this book was such an unexpected book. I had received this book through the bookshop. It sounded interesting, that's why I picked it up and took it home and everything, but I just never kind of felt like reading it. So I just kept it kind of on my side, and then during the Woman in Translation month, I decided I'd pick it up because it was written by a woman and translated, and I loved it. It was so unexpected. It was so different to what I was thinking it was going to be, and then what it delivered was just wonderful. It was like this sort of excerpts from journal exploring this thing, and it was kind of similar to Hanya Yanagihara's The People in the Trees. It had that sort of feel to it. It was just such a really fascinating story, to the point where I was so enveloped in the world of this book that I had to then Google just to make sure that it wasn't real, or it wasn't like happened, like it wasn't based on like a real thing that happened. But then when I did Google that, I found out that the book itself was inspired by a photography exhibition that the author had went to, and she had seen these photos that had been kind of like edited in a way that caught her imagination, and she sort of developed the story of this exhibition, I guess, into the book that I then read, and that kind of added like a whole other layer, which just made me love it even more. And you know, I highly recommend this book. I think if you go into it with as little information as possible, I don't know if I spoiled it by talking about it, but if you go into it with as little knowledge as possible and just let it take you on the journey that it takes you, then I'm sure you will enjoy it. So next, rather than having number 4, I'm having a joint third. So there are 2 books that made third place because I couldn't decide which one I preferred more. So these 2 are equal. And the first one is She Would Be King by Wayétu. I love this book. I have gushed about this book on this channel before. And if you still haven't read it yet, go and pick it up. It's a really brilliant look at the sort of the creation of Liberia as we know it now. And it's this magical realist novel that follows 3 characters in different places, in different moments of their lives, and then their lives begin to sort of intertwine. It is a very place-based book, focused on Liberia, but it happens but the characters also come from different parts, and it's all about the sort of the African slave trade, and then the reclamation of Africa by the slaves, and then the sort of the hierarchies that then were formed between native Liberians and then the people who had then resettled in Liberia, and like the tensions that happened there. It was just a really fascinating book. I think it's one of these books that at one hand very critical, but on the other hand very open-minded, and gives multiple dimensions to the things that's being discussed. There's no bias. It doesn't feel like there's any bias. It doesn't feel like there's any judgment being taken by the author on historic people or the events that happened, but it delivers the story in such a beautiful way that you are forced yourself to make your own sort of questions and queries about history and how we learn history and what we know about identities and making identities and everything. And it was just such a brilliant book. I highly recommend it if you still haven't read it yet, and if you haven't, like, I don't know why you haven't. Go forth and read and enjoy. It should be on many people's top 10 lists, but I don't think it is. I haven't watched many yet, actually, because I'm still trying to find my way back to BookTube, but we shall see. And then joint with She Would Be King is My Father's Wives by José Eduardo Agualusa. Now this book, I had such a good experience with this. So this year The Society of Reluctant Dreamers came out. After reading A General Theory of Oblivion, I was so excited to read more Agualusa's books, but some of them are quite tricky to actually get hold of. So then when this new book came out this year, I was so excited. I had a whole kerfuffle trying to get it, but I finally got it, tweeted about it, and tagged Daniel Han, who is the translator of José Eduardo Agualusa. And then Danny sent me all the other books that are really hard to come by, that are out of print and stuff. And My Father's Wives was one of them. What's really interesting is I picked this one up first of the ones that he sent me because Daniel had said that this was his favourite one. So I was like, well, that's a great recommendation, so I'll read it. And I think, similar to him, it's my favourite. This book is very much the kind of book that I enjoy. Multiple characters, multiple places, all these stories that are intertwining to make one greater story at large. It's a road trip, like, down from Angola, across through South Africa and up on the eastern coast. And it was just very touching. It was really lovely, very well thought out, very well developed. Every single character that came into the story felt like a real person that you could really connect to, and it was just wonderfully written, wonderfully translated. And if you like José Eduardo Agualusa's books, then I think you would really like My Father's Wives. Yes, I think it is definitely one of his strongest ones, of the ones that have been translated so far, but it makes me still excited to read more from both Daniel and José. There's not a whole lot more I can really say about that. It was great. It was brilliant. So number 2 is The Murder Is Eight by Jakob Wegelius. Now this book, I think I've gushed about this book quite a lot on my channel also. I read this fairly early in the year, in the month that I was reading children's literature. It's just really, really beautiful story about Sally Jones, who is a gorilla who can understand human speech, but she can't talk herself. It's a really adventurous story, actually, as her best friend, I guess you can call it her best friend, the captain of the boat that she used to work on, he is convicted of a murder, and she knows that he didn't do it. She knows deep down he didn't do it, and she really wants to free him, and it sets off a whole chain of events and the whole journey kind of around the world, in a way. And it's a children's book that has so much heart, so much goodness to it, but it also just feels like an adult book at the same time. And I think it's one of those books that can really cross generations, and it's no wonder that it was translated from Swedish into English, because so many more people need to read it, which includes you. So if you haven't read it yet, pick it up, read it, enjoy it, love it. And then number 1, my favourite book of the year, I think has to be Ernesto by Umberto Saba. Now this book, it's not so much the story that's being told in the book that I loved so much, but it's the entire book itself, because with the story comes, in this edition of the book that I read, with the story comes a whole context of the story being written, the author's life, and the letters that he was writing whilst writing this book. And I think just as a complete package, there was something really poignant about it, and something that really stayed with me, like, and really kind of stirred me and affected me, and just made that whole experience like something that you so seldom get to experience. I think, well, perhaps we get to experience it a bit more nowadays when we can have access to like authors' websites and things, and authors are more present online and they're talking about themselves, sharing their lives and stuff. For this kind, a book that wasn't even finished during the author's lifetime, it was obviously such a personal book to the author, and with all the hopes and the dreams that were attached to this book, or to the story and to the characters that the author had and talked about with the people that he cared the most about. There was something that really caught me, and there's a lot of things within this entire book, you know, not just the story but the context also, that really resonated with me. I found things that, you know, I could connect with like on a more personal level, which is really, really beautiful, to be able to reach through time and place, to be able to feel somebody else's life and appreciate how, you know, the human experience can be shared across so many different borders, and that's why it's made number one. I'm even getting sad just thinking about it, but yeah, it was just such a lovely experience and a really powerful experience. So they are my top 10. I hope I haven't talked for too long. It was nice. It was nice to kind of get this out and to sit in front of the camera again and to talk a bit more, and hopefully it won't be too long until my next video, so I'll see you then. Bye bye.